This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Romas with you. Today we are going to be talking about a huge topic, but we're going to try to kind of narrow it down for the average listener and mostly for me. But we're going to be talking about hybrid warfare. So we could touch on a number of things in there, from transnational organized crime to espionage, intelligence, foreign influence. It's very broad, so we'll see where we get with this. But for this, I brought in two guests. I have Cynthia Alkon and Scott McGregor on the show. A little background on both. Cynthia Alkon is a law professor and the director of the Criminal Law, Justice, and Policy program at Texas A&M University School of Law in Fort Worth, Texas. Professor Alkon is also a senior fellow and steering committee member of the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare. And in 2024, she taught an innovative new class at Texas A&M University on conflict management and hybrid warfare, which we'll get into in a little bit. And Scott's been on the show a number of times, so if anybody doesn't know who he is, I'll give a little bit of a rundown here. He is former Canadian military intelligence. He was an advisor to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on transnational organized crime and hybrid warfare threats. And he's an advisor for the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare. And last but not least, he is also the co-author of The Mosaic Effect, How the Chinese Communist Party Started a Hybrid War in America's Backyard. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Nathan.
I don't think I could have said hybrid warfare more times. And I think it's like in every single point I had written out for you guys. But this is a fascinating topic, and I don't see it enough in the mainstream side of things that we're talking about it. And I think it really gets lost on people just how convoluted, and I guess complex would be the word, because we're going to get into that, how complex the issues out there are. So we will get more into that. But first, I want to talk with you, Cynthia, just to get a bit of background. How did you get into this world of talking about hybrid warfare from a law perspective? And just tell us, I guess, a bit about the course you were teaching.
Yeah, so I got into it a few years ago. Some folks that I work with in and around the dispute resolution world and dispute resolution academics were part of a project that had been called Project She Shot. We've since morphed and changed into the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare, and I've since joined them in more of a leadership role. We're doing a conference in Montreal. And the idea was to bring people together, academics, people from a variety of sectors, practitioners, to talk about what this is, and with the idea of trying to move things forward and produce writing that's practical, that helps us all to think better about what's going on. And I have to say, when I arrived in Montreal and we started the meeting, my first thought was pretty much how you've opened this, which is, what is hybrid warfare? I've never really talked about it. I've been kind of tangentially involved. They've been playing with some hypotheticals during COVID. This was kind of once things opened up after COVID is when the meeting was in Montreal. So I'd had a little taste of it, but my background, I studied international relations in my undergraduate before going to law school, and I spent a good number of years living and working in the former Soviet and former Yugoslavia. And so I like to think of myself as having maybe more of an outward-looking view than an inward-looking view in terms of the United States. But hybrid warfare was not something that I had really any awareness of beyond my little working with this group. And I remember Scott was there, and there were a number of people who were much more up to speed, including Calvin Krusty, who you both know. And they basically spent the first day trying to explain to the law professors what we're talking about, because what lawyers and law professors love is definitions. And so we needed a definition. Yeah. And what I've come to understand is we're not going to get very far if we just work on what's a definition. That's something we can have forever conversations about and never agree completely. that we need to move beyond just defining, and we need to move into what are some of the practical things that, first of all, we're all facing around the world, and second of all, that we can do to help to counter the threat created by hybrid warfare, or often called hybrid threats too. And it was coming out of this understanding. And once I started working on and writing about this a little bit, and having more and more conversations with folks who were much more up to speed on this topic than I was, I became convinced that we need to start training lawyers. So that's what I do. I spend my days teaching law students who will soon be lawyers. And I realized that not only was I ignorant on this, but so are they. And the reality is that this is so widespread. It's happening in so many sectors in society, and lawyers are at the front lines of it. And so we need to do better in terms of training lawyers and giving them adequate background, and at least at the bottom line, some awareness that this is out there, so they're not operating in
Hmm.
complete ignorance. And so that was the starting point of putting the class together.
And is that what the ultimate goal of building a bigger program? Like, would this maybe turn into some kind of degree, the analysis of hybrid warfare, and that's like a component, or is it strictly like we're going to just focus on law? Because I'm wondering, like, who else should be involved in these conversations? I guess who else should be putting out courses on this? Like, I think it'd be good for politicians to have some awareness of this. But yeah, like where could you take this potentially? I guess.
Well, so the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare has chosen as our two big target areas law and business. And when we think of two
Mm,
big categories that are being hit by, affected by, pulled into situations of hybrid warfare and hybrid threats, these are two big sectors that have, in my view, had very little training background exposure to what we're talking about and what they can do within their professional spheres. So I think there's huge scope for improvement, and certainly politicians too. But I think that's perhaps a little bit different category in terms of how to reach them and how to get better education. But
mm,
in terms of what I think is practical in the near future is doing better training in higher education institutions and doing some training for professionals on the ground. So the class that I offered, this conflict management and hybrid warfare, as far as I know, it's the first course of its kind being offered anywhere in the United States, and we think anywhere in the world.
mhm,
I haven't heard of anyone else doing it. Um, and the goal of the class was to give an exposure to my students who will soon be lawyers to what is hybrid warfare and what are the skill sets that they as lawyers can bring into it when they are confronted with a situation that is hybrid warfare, and or so they recognize when they might be in the middle of something that's hybrid warfare. So in and
mm.
taking the conflict management frame for this, because this is one of the skills that is important in general, I think, for people, but also for lawyers. When lawyers are called in, they're often advising clients, and clients can be complicated, not necessarily complex, but they certainly can be complicated. If we're talking about large corporations, there's a lot of different players when if a corporation is hit by, say, a ransomware, malware attack. Coming into that situation, there will be a variety of people within the corporation that the lawyer may be interfacing with, having to advise, and figuring out how to manage the internal conflicts that happen whenever there's a crisis. Right? It's you've got to deal with whoever the outsides might be, and there may be limited ability to do that. And I think in the conflict in the hybrid warfare space, it's limited. Right? What you can do with those
Okay.
outside, but inside, right? The group that's being attacked, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do so we do better. And so we're better prepared for that.
Yeah. So, kind of just a little bit back on what you were saying, like looking for definitions, and I think this really helps people when we can contextualize and materialize things for them, especially on the law enforcement side, because we deal so much with evidence. Um, One of the lines I took from the paper, you have the name of this paper
It's
there, but I thought this was kind of like would be a good definition for hybrid warfare, unless you have a better one off the top of your head, either you or Scott. But it was a line I read in there, and it said, "An opaque environment with lots of unknowns, many of which remain unknowable, and knowns that are not what they seem." uh, that sounds super scary, but also it's like a lot of confusion and yeah, it's just like, what are we dealing with? So I'm wondering, on the law side, uh, how do you kind of contextualize that for a student, for someone who's practicing? Like what does it look like in practice? Like a real example of how you go, okay, I'm now in hybrid warfare. Like I've crossed this threshold, and what does it look like?
It's hard, right? It's hard because there's so many different ways in which it can manifest, and trying to have students recognize that when it's hard also for the professor to recognize it, right? I mean, this is challenging stuff. Uh, One of the ways that we talked about it a lot was just being open to the fact that you don't know everything. You may not even begin to know everything, and you may not be able to know everything. And for lawyers, we're
Mhm.
used to operating in an environment where we can figure it out. There may be a lot. It may be a case that's got a lot of discovery to it. It may be lots of moving parts and pieces. But if we just buckle down and get all the information, we have all the information that we need, right? We just need to do the work to learn it, to access it, to request it, and then to put it in a framework of the existing law and what do we do with it in terms of what the law allows for. And that works in a whole lot of contexts. I think there are still contexts in the legal practice where it's wanting, but that works in a whole lot of contexts. But it doesn't work when you just can't know everything, and where one of the challenges is just even recognizing it. So, in one of the challenges, in the course we talked about lawfare, which my definition of it, we've got other definitions that fly around, but my definition is when the legal process of a country is being weaponized by another country, entities outside the country, right? So one
Okay.
of the examples we've seen in Scott's, got lots and lots of experience with this in terms of um, China weaponizing the domestic legal system. We've seen examples in Canada. We've seen examples of lawsuits against researchers in the United States who are researching issues around around China, and with the goal being to have a dampening effect on negative reporting and research about China. And the challenge is for a lawyer who's sitting in their office minding their own business, and a potential client comes in and says, "Yeah, I've been slandered. This is libel, and it's against me personally,
Mm.
and I want you to take this case." And lawyers do have an ethical obligation in the United States to know who their client is, and to figure that out. And yet, for the most part, not a lot of time and energy. We take people at face value. We take the cases at face value. We don't do a lot of deep diving into the background. We may do some investigation just to make sure there aren't conflicts of interest, right? That they don't have other cases that the firm or the individual lawyer may also be intersecting with in some way. But there isn't a lot of background that goes on, and this environment we're in right now demands it. If someone comes into your office as a lawyer and says, "I want you to take this case," uh, as a lawyer, you need to be more aware of who you're really representing and what's really.
Well, I guess that kind of goes to like the customer service side. I remember this from banking. Just know your customer, right? And know what you're dealing with. And for a lawyer, though, like I guess if you start doing business with somebody and kind of getting in deeper with them, does that opens up you yourself to a bunch of liability, and maybe now you're seen as tied in with somebody who's not doing the right things for the right reasons?
Potentially, I think the challenge is whoever knows, right? I mean, operating with
Yeah.
so many unknowns and so many situations where people may never fully discover it. Uh, you know, clearly it can. It's one concern. It's something lawyers should be worried about. And also, I think a lot of this operates without a lot of openness, right? So people may never, if they don't start looking, they may never really realize what they've been in the middle of. And it's um, that's one of the concerns, right?
Hmm.
The overall, I think, naive trust that can sometimes be a part of what's going on in terms of how lawyers operate in terms of taking cases to begin with. Um,
Yeah.
Something that these times and the situation that we're all in, I think, demands that we are uh, more skeptical, more cautious, take more care.
And I think one of the points that you made is kind of speaks to having some humility and checking your ego. Like it's, hey, this person comes in, presents a certain way. They might be saying all the right things, but it's like, maybe I should still do some digging, some background checks, and just look into like what exactly am I getting myself into. Don't assume you know everything, right? maybe I'll kind of jump to Scott here. One question I was wondering is, when it comes to hybrid warfare, is it a matter of like one incident can be hybrid warfare, or is hybrid warfare it's always a long game? It always is like, minimum 2 or minimum 3 things happen that are kind of building toward like a longer term goal. Is that kind of what hybrid warfare would, I guess, be?
Well, I think what you're trying to describe is intent. And for hybrid warfare, you're going to have cellular elements that will be acting on their own, which they may not know what else is going on. So the coordination of these things sometimes isn't known to all the actors that are involved, from state and non-state entities. That's where it gets confusing for a lot of people. When you start looking at who your client might be in the legal sense here, who are they responsible to? That's a difficult one to say, because it's not always so as linear as everybody'd like to think. It's not a Western mindset of hierarchy, especially in the Chinese model, where it's more like a house, and people at the top are on even ground. I think Google has a vertical platform, or pardon me, a horizontal platform that's similar to that. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of issues, especially in the legal profession in Canada, where a lawyer is not required to report earning like money that comes in over $10,000 to FinTrack. That's a pretty big thing, given the real estate and other areas where hybrid warfare has been touched on, and it's in open source now. We can talk about these things, so that's a pretty big concern. And then lawyer to lawyer conversations, that's a whole other piece. These people are very smart. They have extremely well-educated individuals working for them, but they also hire some of the top firms and lawyers and private investigator, all that type of stuff. So it gets convoluted, and it's not always as easy to see. Understanding the type of activity tends to be a little bit of an indicator, and I think that's the incident piece that you're speaking to.
Yeah, I guess the intent is it's like the slow erosion of that trust in the systems over time. But depending on who the I guess the ultimate bad guy behind the scenes is what intent is kind of trickling down through people. But they can use so many different means, and everybody else in the middle is, getting their piece of the pie. And so it kind of distorts the meaning. So you never really know who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with, except the person right in front of you or the one that's got the direct communication with you. Is that correct?
That's in line with what I'm saying. I would add that in the case of the Chinese hybrid warfare piece, operations are conducted by different parts of the CCP. So the People's Liberation Army, the MSS, which is their spy agency, MSP, which is their security forces, they all conduct separate operations, sometimes unbeknownst to each other. They don't always work in tandem or in coordination. So what you may encounter or stumble upon or have brought to you, or however you encounter it, it may not be as obvious as you might think. And a lot of times it's not as opaque. I'm going to use the word as opaque, which is where Cynthia's definition is helpful, because the unknowns, you may not have the means to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's recognizing that something is going on.
Yeah.
And once you, then you're able to, start to dig a bit. I don't know if you've ever heard of something called bearer trust, but in the real estate market, this is a concern where one company purchases another company, and within that company, it includes property and other assets. No taxes paid on the property, by the way, in that scenario. So that gets interesting, because then there's nominees that are also often utilized. So the nominees may not show up on the radar of anyone, and you're like, well, what does this mean? So in the absence of information, sometimes there's insights that can be found. Thus the reason that having the education piece for the awareness of these things, especially at the grassroots where people are going to be encountering this, is so vitally important.
I kind of take from that to be trying to learn and get educated, but it's more about being vigilant rather than paranoid, because we want people being paranoid the whole day, thinking everybody's trying to get them. But it's just learning how to ask questions. And like when you see something that you're like, oh, that just seems kind of strange. Like, why is that? Well, dig into that, right? Like go and find out about it and start to, asking the better questions and digging deeper. Um, do you think so? I want to get onto a little bit of the topic of the complex versus complicated that you also spoke about in this in the paper. Can you give us the name of the
Yeah,
paper just before I go too much
yeah,
further?
it's a theory of interest in the context of hybrid warfare. It's complex. And I wrote it with
Yeah,
my good friend and wonderful co-author, Sanda Kaufman, who's also on the Council for Countering Hybrid Warfare.
I'll post that when I start putting up some of the links and in the episode description too. But the idea of complicated versus complex, and it was in terms of negotiations. As I was reading that, I was just taking out the word negotiation and basically just putting anything in there, like any kind of policy, anything you see at your workplace, and I could find that it was applicable, right? Like it really explains like just understanding a problem. Step back before you start screaming and shouting. Step back, try to just get a grasp on what you're looking at, and then again, dig, ask the questions, and try to have some understanding before you go forward. And in the case of negotiations, you're trying to get to some end point with this person that you're negotiating with. But can you explain a bit for listeners just the difference between the complicated and complex, the two terms, and how you were kind of using them?
Yeah, so we're going to have a more eloquent explanation in the article, but so
Yeah,
people wanted something. It's more
it's all good.
beautifully, worded, and in large part that's Sanda's wonderful work. It's really coming out of her background and knowledge. That we had this concept to bring in, and I have found it, like you said, it's super useful in other contexts, not just in hybrid warfare. I've started using it when I'm thinking about our criminal legal system in the United States and reform and all that, because
Yeah.
basically what we're talking about is anything where there's so many different moving pieces that you can't, by making one change, you're not going to control everything, right? So,
Hmm.
something that's complicated, right? We can work through what the pieces are. We know how they interact and interrelate with each other. The classic example that we've got in the article is an airplane engine, right? That this is we know how airplanes work. They're complicated. They're very complicated. I personally don't know the ins and outs of how they work, other than hopefully they take off and land without a problem, right? But you can, if you have the right professional background, you have the right training skills, whatever, you can learn what you need to know about how an airplane works, and you can identify what the problems are if it fails to work, and we can then fix it, right? It's all because this is something that's complicated, but it's something that you can figure it out, right? A complex system or complex thing, I don't even know that we call it a system, is something where it's difficult to impossible to get your head around it in that way. If we look at, and we can take this to almost any larger policy questions that we've got, and when we're looking at it in the context of hybrid warfare, right? It's complex because we don't necessarily know who's out there. We don't necessarily know what their goals are. We don't necessarily know what the end game is of any particular thing that they're doing at this moment in time. And so when we're thinking about how do we address something like hybrid warfare, coming up with one single approach, or for those who would, the opposite of humility would be say you've got a solution for hybrid warfare, right? To say you've got one big idea that's going to solve it, right? This just doesn't happen in a complex situation. And so, when we put it in some other context, like you put it in the context of what do we do with our criminal legal system in the United States? Well, one of the simple solutions that was offered years ago was we just imprison people longer. That'll solve our problem of crime, and that'll solve it. Well, of course, it created 16 new problems, right? And we have mass in the United
Yeah.
States, and we have a whole raft of other issues in terms of how the criminal legal system is working and the impact it's had on society. And that one simple solution, which sounded really attractive to a lot of politicians, in fact, has created a variety of other problems. And that's the concern, right? When we take something that we really do need to step back from it. We need to recognize the complexity of it and recognize that there can be ways to address it. And also, we need to be mindful that we need to be constantly analyzing what we're doing and what the impact is and whether we need to back down from it. And this is the humility piece of it, right? This may seem like a really good approach right now, and then we do take a little bit more time, look at it, go dig a little deeper, do a little bit more investigation. Realize, no, that was really a bonehead move. That wasn't the best way to address this. We need to be able to step back and say, okay, let's try something else.
Yeah.
Right? And I one of the challenges when we're dealing with complexity is it shouldn't be that we get so overwhelmed that we do nothing, right? In particular contexts that where it's important, right? It really matters. And we can't, inaction is an action too, right? And inaction is something that can create more problems down the road also. So it's about being able to recognize that we're in a complex situation, recognize that we don't have all the answers, recognize that there's going to be more information coming in, recognize that there may be things that we do that we realize, okay, let's not do that again, or we need to figure out how to fix the 16 new problems that particular action might have caused, right? But it's being open to that reality and not holding fast. I think one of the challenges when we're talking about complexities, you don't want to hold fast to one way of doing things as you start to realize that's not really working. We need to move on and we need to do something. Having flexibility along with it is an extraordinarily important piece of how to manage in a complex environment.
As you're kind of giving the explanation there and just thinking back to some of the stuff I was reading in that article, when I think about complicated, it makes me think like if I was to make a visual for people, it'd be like the New York subway system. It's like it's got multiple levels, and there's lots of things going on. There's millions of people moving around, but the tunnels don't change. It's like we can follow the flow chart of where things go. And yeah, issues can happen, and maybe we'll be like, well, there's like a bunch of things that made that problem, and we got to fix it. But then when I think of complex, I think of like a spider web overlaid of other spider webs, and spider webs fall down, and then you got a whole different situation. You got to remake it. Well, it's not remade the exact same, and it's just there's so many moving parts. Like you're saying, you can't just trace things right back to like one thing and be like, well, if we would have done that different, this would have been, the outcome I wanted. It's a lot of letting go of kind of the future plans, dealing with what you have now, and just trying to guide things. And maybe you can help me on this, Scott. But it's kind of trying to guide things in a direction you want them to go, but you ultimately don't know what that's going to look like in the end. So you have to be comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think the reactive and proactive stuff is applicable because some of the outcomes when you make a decision that affects what's going on in a complex question like this, things change, intentions change, and that can be because there's contingency planning on the other side of the equation. So they know that if they've been found out, they're to do X. We don't know what X is. Sometimes it's leaving the country. Now what? So now you had an entity that you've identified and they're no longer here and you can't reach them.
Yeah.
That makes it extremely difficult to grasp what's going on. So the full context of the issue at hand. And complex is a nice way of saying it. I mean, it's even, if there was another word to make it even more than just complex, I would use it, because sometimes you just don't know. And you can spend a lifetime, like Cynthia said, you could be an expert in this, but you have to be humble and understand that you're not an expert in everything. You may know a bit about cyber. You may know a bit about the financial side. You may know it. That's great, but it can be in all of those areas at the same time. And you're not an expert in maybe you're not in any of them. So you have to seek these people out to try to have a better grasp on what could be happening. And then that's reactionary. So something's happened and now you're reacting. To be proactive, you'd have to understand who is acting in a hybrid warfare model in your area, your region, your industry, or whatever. to at least have an awareness of what can happen. And what Cynthia, I think, is doing is amazing, because here you are in a classroom and you're able to give examples, because now we have information that we can look back at and go, oh, well, look at this. This was connected to something else. We see a lot of arrests in the
Mhm.
United States. We see people that are taking intellectual property, that are trying to sell national secrets. And that's not all just happenstance. A lot of this is by design, and influence. When you put things in play, they don't always control them. The results come. So if you
Yeah.
you throw your handful of spaghetti against the wall, and some of it sticks and some of it doesn't, you don't know which ones are going to stick necessarily.
So it kind of comes down to who can adapt maybe faster, better. It's about that being able to mold yourself to the
The
problem.
OODA loop stuff. Yeah, I agree.
And I think it requires a certain comfort level in the unpredictability of it all, right? And that not
Hmm.
necessarily comfort that we love it, but comfort level in the sense that we can still operate, right? And that we're not being so flummoxed by the unpredictability of things that we're not doing anything, right?
Yeah. I if I was to compare this to a law enforcement context, so like I go out on the road and I respond to 911 calls, and it's never what's on the call. And so you show up and they say it's A and you're like at Z, and it's like it's crazy. Um, but you have to be comfortable with that, right? Knowing I'm walking in and anything can happen. And as soon as I cross this threshold, Scott, when you're saying like, is there a better word for complex? I was kind of thinking of just calling it shit show, because that's probably what we would call it on the street. So it's yeah, it's like you really don't know, and it's like who can thrive in those environments and who can't. Um, I guess if we look at like, so we'll talk a little bit of current events, and just looking at like all the political stuff going on with Canada, US, and everybody else. But like I see that as like the ultimate hybrid warfare situation where people are very quick, like 7-minute clip comes out of the Zelensky Trump thing, but there's really like an hour-long discussion. But people are right away like quick to jump on, a quick clip and give their full expert opinions. And you're like, I don't know what kind of expert you are if you didn't realize there's like a full video behind that. So I just wonder, like, when you look at the situations we're in now, uh, how do we even wrangle any of that back in? Like, it's just, what do we do to get people to understand more and maybe take a pause, take a breath, and then try to come up with a strategy for some of this?
I mean, I think it's a challenge, and maybe I'll just put it, not in the necessarily in the context of what's happened in the White House in the last many days, but in the context of my classroom, right, which is a little bit easier
Yeah.
for me to focus on. And the with a number of my students, the class was great fun for me to put together. And one of the things we did is we brought in a lot of guest speakers, including Scott. Um, and also, my students were really a microcosm of what we're dealing with in the world, right? So, some of my students had a
Hmm.
lot of international experience and background and awareness and familiarity, and some not at all. Some their undergraduate degrees. So in the United States, law school is a graduate program, so they all have undergraduate degrees, and they were in a variety of things that didn't necessarily mean that they had a background in the geopolitics of our world right now, or any particular understanding of the history of Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, and how the interactions between all of our nations for the years coming out of World War II, and not understanding the historical context of things and then putting it into the current geopolitics. It's a real challenge when we have people without any understanding of history, right? And students
Hmm.
caught on really quickly, and they were getting up to speed and recognizing if they didn't have the background in terms of not having been studying Russia for years, right? They weren't Russia experts per se, right? But getting up to speed to a point, and the same with getting up to speed to a point with China, right? And this is where once again the humility comes in, recognizing that history didn't start today, right? Whatever it is
Yeah.
on the media and in the TV, this is not the first thing. This is the latest, and it's the latest in a series of things that trace back to a long history, and a long, complicated, if not complex, history. Right, when we're talking about the geopolitics of where we are now, this didn't come out of a box brand new. It's built on what's been, and having some understanding of that, and trying to look back. And the challenge also is, just because we know what has been doesn't mean we know what will be, right? And there's also that challenge, right? How do we get a um, make sure that we are taking into account history, which uh, always matters and is rarely sufficiently
Hmm.
discussed when we're talking about the geopolitics of our world. And also, what does that mean in the here and now, and where things might go in the future? Because that's also understanding, to a degree, as much as we can, internal dynamics in places, and what are priorities, and where are the power structures. And this becomes even tougher in countries that are less open, right? So when we're looking at places like China and Russia, um, they don't have the same kind of media that we've got here. And I certainly have some challenges with how much our media is doing investigative reporting that they maybe could or should be doing in the here and now. But it's different in a whole lot of other countries. And we look at other countries that are part of the hybrid warfare concern, like Iran or North Korea. It's even harder, right? We know even less about some of the things that are
Yeah.
going on, and and we know some about the history, but maybe not fully, right? And North Korea is not exactly an open book, right, in terms of understanding what's been motivating them, and yet they're a player in terms of raising money through um, ransomware, malware, things like that. So, so I think there's all of this that's in the mix, and trying to once again raise some awareness of the importance of having some understanding and recognizing that you may not have the full picture.
Well, and I guess people can't even necessarily agree on history because it's, depends who wrote it. And then, everybody's got their own spin on that now. And it's like, where's the common ground we can start from?
Well, and understanding that people do have different views of it, right? I mean, our view of what Russian history is often very different from what a Russian's view of it might be, right? And and it
Yeah.
is. I know when I first started working in some of the countries that I worked in Eastern Europe, just recognizing how hard it is to really understand what's behind what people are doing, right? It's, when they're different cultures, there's different histories, they've got different personal experiences. Understanding what's behind an act, and when people are going to speak and when they're not going to speak. People say as much through silence as they do through words, right? And having an awareness of that, and seeing it and recognizing it. And so when I pull that into the classroom for my students, it's not that anyone's going to become an expert in a one semester class, of course not, but just to have an awareness. And this is, once again, we keep coming back to humility,
Hmm.
right? Because this is, lawyers, as you both know, are not necessarily, that's not necessarily our strongest suit, is being humble and having humility. And it was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the class, is that my students really quickly grasped, oh yeah, this is an important skill for us. We need to be humble in the face of this. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we may never know. And I kept seeing that. I had writing assignments for the students, and I kept seeing that coming back in the writing assignments. It was a lesson that was very much internalized by my students during the course of the semester. And that alone is extraordinarily important in terms of skill sets moving into how to manage in this complex environment.
Yeah, it makes me think. So I was working with one of the local schools here. It's Grant McEwen University, and we did a course. And the when I did the pitch to them, it was about getting veterans, so police veterans, partner with students to get their stories out. But a large uh, thought, or a large driver behind that, was to just educate them, right, and like give that awareness piece of, to kind of counter some of the current narratives at the time that the course was going on. This is coming out of George Floyd, BLM, like a whole bunch of things that were happening. So it was like, well, why don't we partner them and go straight into the academic sphere, the young minds, because they're the future leaders, the future policy makers and decision makers. Like, why don't we go straight to them and show them, right? Like, humanize this job, show them like these are people that live next door to you in your neighborhood. Like, so I think I really like that piece that you're talking about, like doing this within the academic world, teaching the people, and then they go out and that kind of spreads that message from there, right? And there'll be future professors in there, or running a company, and then it trickles down from them. On Scott's side of things, I'm wondering, with the hybrid warfare, how else can you educate people, like outside of academia, Where would you advise, or where could people learn about this if they're interested in it?
Well, that's a good question. I think the Council for Countering Hybrid Warfare is trying to address that to a certain extent. Obviously, we've identified the legal professions and businesses.
Business. Yeah.
There has to be that interest in wanting to know. That's the difficulty. Right now, we're seeing change through media, and media is creating an awareness. I mean, the term hybrid warfare was shunned by academics for a long time because it was just too harsh. So unrestricted warfare, gray zone operations, a plethora of different terminology to try to describe something that's all pretty much the same thing. And now it's becoming a lot more accepted. The word Five Eyes, people didn't know what Five Eyes was. And now it's in the media, and now people are starting to become aware of what that is and how important it is. So the general understanding, I would compare it to the early days of the internet, when if you knew how to make a web page, you could make a lot of money. And as time went on, people learned how to do that themselves. And so now you've got people coding, and kids are coding. It's a similar type of dialogue that would have to take place.
So it's a culture shift.
Yeah, a culture shift. And not to mention the fact that sentiment has changed. I would say that people weren't aware that China is a national security threat, because they've been operating in Canada for so long, in Canada and the United States and elsewhere, but without any real repercussions or awareness until it affects individuals, which in the Vancouver sense, it was real estate. As soon as people realized, oh my God, my kids will never be able to buy a house, suddenly it became a big deal. That's when it hits home, right? That's the cyber stuff that Cynthia was mentioning, ransomware, etc. You believe that you've done all the right things, you've got your protections in place and everything, and suddenly, well, your massive government corporation is in trouble. Your crown corporation's been attacked, and they're holding all the information on citizens. Now, what do you do? So again, that's precautionary.
Yeah.
You've done some precautionary stuff, but if you don't understand the scope of that, because that may only be a part of what's going on, it's not the actual entire operation. It's just one piece of undermining critical infrastructure, etc. So that gets interesting. I think that your podcast and others have been raising awareness about what's going on, not always specifically on hybrid warfare itself. Although I think that that awareness is growing rapidly, and I think Cynthia's work is going to be probably the biggest factor in one of our target areas in the lawfare piece. I think that's huge. I was going to say there's a bunch of things that can impact this. From root cause analysis, where if you're looking at what this stems from, I think you'd have to be fairly well read to understand those types of things. And if you're in your daily work, I would mention the term locus of control. So you're in your job, and you're letting, you're going through the motions. You got your procedures and your policies and your directives, and it's all standard stuff. And once you've been there a while, you do it on autopilot. That locus of control is where you're letting the world dictate to you what's happening. If you take the other approach, which is you take control of that and you start deciding what you're going to be looking at, and maybe there's efficiencies and changes and transitions that need to occur. That is the type of thinking I think Cynthia is providing to these students. I think she's opening their minds, because a mind is like a parachute, only works when it's open, and that's a driving factor in making change. And right now we're in a world of transition, with global powers shifting, alliances being tested, a number of different things that are going on. And if you think that's not part of hybrid warfare, then you're missing the point of this entire conversation.
Well, and you know what? Maybe that'll kind of bring me to one last thing we could probably fit in here, and I'll get both your opinions on this. But this was out of the paper too. Becoming like your attacker. So, is there, like, when you're dealing with hybrid warfare, I guess sometimes you have to accept that you might have to push your moral and ethical boundaries. Am I reading that kind of correctly? Like, you might have to play more in the gray zone because things aren't so clearly defined. The rules are not clearly set. So, you have your morals and your ethics that you think you're bound by, but then certain things happen that are out of your control where you're like, well, now I have to choose between the lesser of two evils, or if I ultimately want to save all these people here, I'm going to have to do something bad over there. Like, is that part of hybrid warfare, those choices?
Maybe I'll start from a lawyer's perspective and what lawyers are doing, and I would say no, we don't compromise our ethics. Right? This is extraordinarily important. We've got ethical rules that we're bound by, and being in difficult situations is when those rules matter, right? And matters to follow them. And to be clear, our ethical rules are really a bottom line level of ethical and moral behavior. They're not the highest level and the highest standard. And how I talk about this with my students is there's the ethical rules and then there's your own morality. And if your own morality doesn't even meet the ethical rules, then follow the ethical rules. But if your own morality is higher than the ethical rules, do that, right? Because at the end of the day, we all need to be true to ourselves, and we need to be true to where our values are. And truly, at the end of the day, in a hybrid warfare context, if we give that up, we have lost, in my view. We need to be clear about what it is that we're fighting against. And one of the things I think we're fighting against is the entities and those out there who don't share our values for the basics of living in a free society and treating people, at least in an ideal, we don't always reach it, with decency and respect, right? And following law, we also don't always reach that when we're in an era where that's more challenging, right? But following the law really matters as free countries, Western democracies, right? We have laws are made through a democratic process, which speaks to our societal values, and they should be followed. Now, it doesn't mean that policymakers at a foreign policy level aren't confronted with some other questions, right? But in terms of how lawyers are interacting with this, right, it's important that lawyers are being clear on what is the law, what our ethical duties are in terms of how we're representing and assisting clients and things. Now, the law is not keeping up, and that's another issue, right? When we're talking, rarely keeps up with things that are moving quickly, and that's
largely reactive.
Yeah, and that's another issue, and that's where lawyers can have a role in the policy making. What is the law? I mean, the law in this space is very narrow. It's really just looking at what needs to be reported. I think that's really what it all comes down to in terms of where the legal frameworks are right now, which are inadequate to the task that we're facing. And also, lawyers need to know what those are and make sure those, at the very least, those are being complied with. And also perhaps be advocates for improving and making a legal framework that makes better sense in this environment.
Scott's answer is going to be send in the SEALs.
No. I think what Cynthia just described is appropriate. However, I would say that that is a definite vulnerability that is exploited by threat entities, and I'm not going to say which ones because all of them pretty much, from Iran to the cartels to China, morals and ethics are questionable, and in war, you may go into a war with some morality and ethics, but oftentimes that gets challenged, and the difficulty is trying to follow a set of guidelines and rules that restrict you from achieving, let's just say there's genocide that's occurring and you want to stop it. Well, in order to stop it, you're constrained. You can only do these certain things because that is what's morally right and legally right. So guess what? That genocide is going to continue unless you do something that is going to cross those lines. That's when it gets sticky. That's when the whole complex question comes in, because it's a slippery slope. And I agree with Cynthia that taking that moral high ground whenever possible is absolutely right. But I would offer this: China is committing genocide. That's a fact. And yet here we are doing business with a country that commits genocide. Is that morally correct? I'd say no, but it's a fact of life that
Yeah.
in negotiations and in world economics, that you have to put up with some of these things, right?
Yeah.
And that includes, I mean, when you're looking at these, if you're going to go into a contract negotiation with the Chinese entity, it's state run or state owned. You're not dealing with a company like you would in the United States. They have different rules, and they may write them down and make it sound great, but when it comes down to implementing them, that's a whole other thing. Those people get disappeared. The company no longer exists or is merged with another one or acquired by another one. You don't necessarily know what kind of business you're in, and yet here we are doing business with these people. And I would say that there's definitely a moral question there. Ethics and morals is a fine line, and I think in the criminal side of it, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think on the business side of it, it gets dicey. You like your
Yeah.
films that are being made for by 5-year-olds. That's child exploitation. And yet
Mhm.
you go ask how many people have iPhones. You know what I mean? Like it's a difficult one to stick to. And maybe there's different levels of it.
You know what? Yeah. It just makes me think of like the judgment that we put on people in certain situations. Like certainly we have our laws and things that we have to follow, and you'll be judged by those. But maybe in the moral sense, you might be like, well, like I don't know what else that person could have done, but you're still going to have to answer because this is the law we kind of set. It's just, yeah, it's such a complex situation. I think you guys kind of gave me like it's like reading a good Batman novel. I'm a huge nerd, so I do comic book reference, but it's literally it's that kind of stuff, right? He's never going to kill, but he's got a lot of he gets right to the point sometimes, like right on the line, and then there's a lot of questions around like, well, is what I'm doing right? The vigilante type stuff, and then it's like, well, I'm going to have to answer for that one day. So uh, and maybe in the legal sense, for Cynthia, some of that might be more clear cut, more defined. But then, as Scott's kind of saying, like, yeah, there's certain situations outside of that you do have to kind of gauge um, where you land on things, I guess.
But I,
So,
I still agree with Cynthia. If I was in a negotiation and I felt strongly like it was going against my moral fiber, then I agree with her. I say then don't do it.
yeah,
But and I think Scott raises a interesting and important point that doesn't really get discussed as much in the law, which is like the moral question of who are we doing business with, right? So
Mhm.
legally, there's nothing particularly wrong with doing business with China, right? Depending on what you're doing business, obviously, for in areas like selling arms, okay, there's rules and such that regulate that, but in the big picture, there's nothing particularly wrong with it. And yet, right, it may go against the personal values and morals of a particular person or client, and it might be something that is important to raise, right? Just because one can do something doesn't mean one should do it, and that's important to
Yeah.
have those conversations and to be putting it in this bigger context of what are we supporting? Are we supporting things that really do align with our values? And I agree, Scott, and we've talked about this in other contexts, right? It, the things that are our strength are also our vulnerabilities, right? And being part of an
Yeah.
open society with an open legal system and with free flowing information is our strength and is our vulnerability. And this is the challenge
Mhm.
that we face.
Yeah. Very good. That brings us right to the end of our time. Just want to give you each an opportunity to say where people can find you or follow you. We'll start with you, Cynthia.
So I don't have much of a social media presence, so I don't have an Instagram or anything that anyone can follow. But I'm at Texas A&M University School of Law. You can easily find me on the website there, and also through the Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare and some of the work that we've been doing on this, including some of the work that I've done and others in this wonderful group. And Scott's a part of the group too. The publications that have come out, and I think it's a tremendous resource for those that are interested in what's going on in this area and in practical thinking about what we can
Mhm.
think about this incredibly complex area.
Yeah, and I'll get all those links up certainly to, especially the publications. I'll be reading more about them. And Scott, you got the book, Mosaic Effect. I'll get the links up for that as well. And anywhere else?
Yeah, you can follow me on X at 5eyes Scott. I'm on LinkedIn, and the same with Cynthia with Council on Countering Hybrid Warfare. I think we have some new publications that should be coming out in the near future. And there's definitely a high academic rigor that's applied to these things. These aren't your casual reads necessarily, but they are very practical, like Cynthia said. And then if you just Google, there's plenty of information there. I have a PR website called hybridwar.ca that kind of covers some of the podcasts and interviews and work that I've done in the field.
Awesome. I got you out of here just on time. So I want to say thanks for coming on today, and I'll let you go. We'll chat later.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.